Now, the rest of the story. Behold, a man facing the end. His name is John. He's a slight gentleman, 5'7", with round, wrinkled face, shiny bald head, wisps of white hair at his temples, eyes that seem always watery, thin lips incessantly pressed together, utterly alone. He sits in the dilapidated old house that had been his father's. There, in his despondent isolation, the stillness itself seems to scream. In heavy black ink, he scrawls in his diary these words: "The sun of my life sets in the deepest gloom." There is an addition. Quote, "I have no plausible motive for wishing to live, when everything that I foresee makes death desirable, and when I have the clearest indications that it is near at hand. A cough nags him, his bones ache. How long, he wonders, must he endure the sadness and the indignity of his last days on earth? In his diary again, no one knows the agony of mind that I have suffered." Well, indeed, after 40 years of service, he has been summarily turned out to pasture. The feelings of rejection are almost more than he can bear. And as though professional humiliation is not enough, there has been great personal strife. Bad investments have left John with little money. His wife is ailing. His son, a heavy drinker and gambler, killed himself. And now, with little to remind him of the good times, the lonely house echoes a procession of failures and frustrations. Perhaps it would be easy for John to take his own life now, but not as easy as it had been for his son. For deep down in John's soul, fighting everything he feels, is the flickering spirit of self-preservation. So somehow, for some reason, he must hang on. The still life torrent of clutter around the old house mocks John in his misery. The papers and the books stacked floor to ceiling, the remnants of food half-eaten days ago. No matter, for slowly all of John's surroundings are fading into the oblivion that enshrouds him. One day soon, he is certain, all will have vanished forever. This is the portrait of a man at the end of the road. A sensitive fellow by nature, he is all the more in anguish. September of 1830, the absolute low point in his 63 years. After 4 decades of public service, he is abandoned to his regrets, grieving hopelessly, awaiting death. But if the record shows that John Quincy Adams, after all those years of public life, capped by 4 years as President of the United States and a failed campaign for a second term, if the record shows that he toppled into utter despair when it was over, let it also be told that it was not all over. For following those bleakest months in Adams' life was another life. He ran for Congress, and he served in the House half of Congress another satisfying 14 years. History relates that John Quincy Adams collapsed in Congress February 1848 and died peacefully 2 days later. This after 17 satisfying years in the House of Representatives. And, of course, that is so. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now, the rest of the story. John Quincy Adams is largely forgotten these days. When he is mentioned, it's usually because he was the son of our second president, John Adams. John Quincy witnessed the American Revolution, the creation and evolution of the new nation, and the events that directly led to the Civil War. He spent most of his life in service to the American people, and we need to know more about him. John Quincy Adams was born to John and Abigail Adams on July the 11th, 1767, in this house in Braintree, Massachusetts. He was named after his mother's father, a colonial American soldier and politician. John Quincy was educated by private tutors, and he exhibited fine literary skills. In this episode, Mr. Harvey read entries from John Quincy's diary. He began his diary in November 1779 when he was just 12 years old. He began keeping a diary because he was on the cusp of a grand adventure. He was accompanying his father to Europe, where he, founding father John Adams, served as a diplomat on missions to France and the Netherlands in support of the American Revolution. His first entry was recorded on Friday, November the 12th, 1779. He wrote, "This morning at about 11 o'clock, I took leave of my mama, my sister, and brother Tommy, and went to Boston with Mr. Thaxter in order to go on board the frigate the Sensible of 12-pounders. We arrived at Boston at 1 o'clock, dined at my Uncle Smith's. We expected to go on board in the afternoon, but we could not conveniently till tomorrow." They left for Europe 3 days later. While in Europe, John Quincy studied law, French, Dutch, German, Greek, and Latin, and attended multiple schools, including Leiden University, which remains the oldest university in the Netherlands. In 1781, John Quincy served as the secretary and translator for the American diplomat Francis Dana in St. Petersburg, Russia. 2 years later, in 1783, he returned to Paris, this time as his father's official secretary during negotiations to end the Revolutionary War. While in Great Britain, John Quincy and his family decided that he needed to return to the United States to complete his education and to begin his political career. He was educated at Harvard College and graduated second in his class in 1787. After graduation, John Quincy studied law for 2 years. In 1790, the same year his father was elected the first vice president of the United States, John Quincy opened his own law practice in Boston. Once it got off the ground, he became financially independent of his parents. But rather than beginning his political career, John Quincy focused on growing his law practice. But that changed in 1794 when George Washington asked John Quincy to become the U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. Now, John Quincy admired George Washington, but said he'd have to think about it. He almost declined the appointment, but ultimately decided to take the appointment because of the advice of his father. At the time, France was in the middle of what we now call the French Revolution. Despite the fact that France helped us during the American Revolution, John Quincy urged neutrality in the French Revolution. The United States was just too young of a country to risk getting mixed up in another revolution. In the winter of 1795-1796, John Quincy was in London where he met and fell in love with Louisa Catherine Johnson, daughter of an American merchant. They married in 1796. He followed that diplomatic appointment as U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands with another appointment in Prussia during his father's presidency. When Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams, that's John Quincy's father, in the presidential election of 1800, John Quincy resigned and returned home to run for a seat in the Massachusetts legislature. In 1803, he was appointed to the U.S. Senate, where he bucked party lines, sided with Jefferson, and supported the Louisiana Purchase. In return for his allegiance to the Democratic-Republican Party, President James Madison appointed John Quincy as the first official U.S. minister to Russia. While abroad, he negotiated the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, and served as the U.S. minister to Great Britain. When the Adamses returned to Washington, D.C. in 1817, John Quincy served as Secretary of State for President James Monroe. He authored the Monroe Doctrine, which declared the United States' intention to resist European intervention in Latin America. He worked to acquire Florida for the United States and to improve Anglo-American relations by settling the border dispute in the Oregon Country. He was one of the most accomplished and successful Secretaries of State in American history. During John Quincy's time abroad, slavery had expanded into most homes, and Washington, D.C. was a thriving hub for the domestic slave trade. The Adamses first rented a home before purchasing a house at 244 F Street, which was previously occupied by President James Monroe. They were surrounded by enslaved people and the slave trade. They lived 1 block from the Washington jail, which served as a prison and slave pen. Their close friends and neighbors owned enslaved people, and they attended parties and diplomatic events hosted by many prominent slave-owning families, parties made possible by enslaved labor. That being said, John Quincy was a vocal opponent of slavery. In 1824, John Quincy won a bitter election over Andrew Jackson and became president. As president, John Quincy promoted international improvements such as a national road and a network of canals, but most of his proposals were ahead of the time and were rejected by Congress. While the Adamses lived in the White House, Louisa Catherine's niece and nephew lived with them, and they brought 2 enslaved people that they had inherited from their father. Despite John Quincy's opposition to slavery, it was legal, and they were considered legal property of his niece and nephew. He did not own the slaves. Now, I'm sure that subject was the center of many family discussions. In 1828, Andrew Jackson defeated John Quincy's re-election bid, but his retirement from public life was short-lived. 2 years later, he ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives and spent the next 2 decades railing against slavery, the power of the slaveocracy, and the gag rule that stifled debate on the issue in Congress. Because of his age and personal history of service, Southerners could not threaten him with physical violence like they did to the other, younger Northern congressmen. In 1841, he argued in front of the Supreme Court in the United States versus Amistad case and won the release of enslaved African captives. On February 20th, 1848, John Quincy made his last entry into his diary. He said, "Fair lady, thou of human life, hast yet but little seen. Thy days of sorrow and of strife are few and far between. In days of yore the poet's pen from wing of bird was plundered, perchance of goose, but now and then from Jove's own eagle sundered, but now metallic pens disclose." On the following day, February 21st, 1848, John Quincy suffered a stroke while sitting at his desk on the floor of the House of Representatives. He was moved to the Speaker's room in the Capitol building where he went into a coma. 80-year-old John Quincy Adams died 2 days later on February 23rd, 1848. In the 68 years that John Quincy Adams kept his diary, he recorded things that, well, they probably seemed trivial at the time. The importance of his diary has only become evident with the passage of time. Now, what if we all kept diaries? What kind of things would you have recorded by now? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. Be sure to share this video with a friend because we want them to know the rest of the story.